Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome back to our Evolution and Ecology seminar series. My name is Elizabeth Duxbury, and I'm a postdoc in the research group of Alexei Maklikov at the University of research community for this initiative, and we've been honoured to host such a variety of great minds so far. So thank you all for your fantastic engagement in the series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind you that there will be a Q&A session directly after the talk. So please post your questions in the dedicated Slack channel and upvote questions that you'd like to hear. We aim to keep the whole session to 1 hour in length. So it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Bill Sutherland, Miriam Rothschild Professor of Conservation Biology in the Department of Zoology at the University of Cambridge, and Associate Fellow at the Centre for Science and Policy. Bill's research explores the impacts of environmental change on population ecology and biodiversity, and also the translation of conservation biology research into policymaking and practice. During a remarkable 40-year career, Bill has combined his passions for fieldwork, including research into the ecology of migratory birds and the impacts of agriculture and climate change on biodiversity, with the application of ecological models to address conservation problems. Bill is a strong advocate for evidence-informed decision-making in policy and has been actively involved in horizon scanning, evidence collation on effective interventions, and the rigorous weighting of evidence to guide policy decisions. He also established Conservation Evidence, a valuable resource providing evaluation of research to assist conservation practitioners in maintaining and restoring biodiversity. Bill has received many prestigious awards throughout his career, including the Distinguished Service Award from the Society for Conservation Biology, and last year he was awarded honorary membership of the British Ecological Society. This is testament to Bill's outstanding contribution to conservation biology and ecology research. Today, Bill will present his talk entitled Covid-19, Leaving the Lockdown, Reducing Risk of Further Pandemics, and Improving the Use of Science in Policy Decisions. So Bill, thank you for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for that kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. And it's great that you've got this series of online seminars. I watched some. I'm very impressed by how these have worked. So I'd like to, so as Elizabeth said, I'm a conservation biologist, a population ecologist, that sort of thing. But I've become interested in COVID-19. I'd like to talk about what we've been doing there and what we could learn about science and policy. And I'd just like to start off by saying that this is difficult, that having to make policy decisions in this fog of evidence is really hard. And it's a challenging thing to do. And in retrospect, we will go back and realize that there are various things that should have been done differently. And there's an army of people at the moment making criticisms of things. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to talk about when we should leave lockdown, masks, quarantines, all those sorts of things. What I'd like to do is talk about the policy process. I'd also just like to say there's lots of criticism of the government. I'd just like to say there's some things that they did fantastically well. So the Nightingale hospitals were set up at very short notice, and I think that's a remarkable piece of logistics. So to start off, what they've done is really difficult, and I want to talk more about how we can improve the processes. So I really want to talk about 8 different aspects which I've been thinking about. Firstly, how do we leave lockdown? How do we stop there being further pandemics? How do we use science within policymaking? How do we make decisions incorporating experts? I'd like to think about how we could change publications so we could have peer review in 90 minutes. And I briefly want to talk about some of the environmental consequences, some of the consequences for individual scientists, and then how do we improve science to policy making. So So why am I involved? I'm involved through two routes. The main route is something called BioRisk, the Biosecurity Research Initiative at St. Catherine's. St. Catherine's is a college at Cambridge, which is a very kind donation given by Claudia and David Harding. And they have a team of postdocs and fellows looking at biosecurity issues. And also, as Elizabeth mentioned, we have a team of postdocs with our conservation evidence project. Here we are celebrating having read our millionth paper, and we're very interested in collating evidence. So I'd just like to start off by talking a little bit more about BioRisk, our project. This is our launch a year ago in Parliament, and it's launched by one of the members of the BioRisk team, Des Brown, Lord Brown, used to be a lawyer, very interesting figure. Was a minister, Labour minister. He wrote the legislation, worked out the process for the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement. Very impressive person. And one of the points we made at the launch was the UK had its biological security strategy, which it had had for a year, but hadn't really put in place. And we're saying there's a real urgent need to put that in place. So if you look at the forward of that strategy, it starts off by saying significant outbreaks of disease amongst the highest impact risks faced by any society, threatening lives and causing disruption to public services in the outbreak. This is true whether such outbreaks occur naturally, such as pandemics, emerging diseases, etc. So pandemic diseases are right up there. And then if you look at the final page, which is sort of how do you do it, it sort of says you've got to work across different portfolios. You really want a governance board that will report to the Threats, Hazard and Resilience and Contingency Subcommittee of the National Security Council through the Security Minister, which seems in order for this to work, it needs a strategy to be implemented, and they have a clear strategy. The problem is that someone called Jason Lai, who I don't know, put in a Freedom of Information request saying, can you tell me whether or not these subcommittees exist? Threats, Hazard, Resilience and Contingency Subcommittee, the one that would deliver the strategy. And then it says, this subcommittee does not exist. So although there's a plan for it to occur, it clearly wasn't set up. And then, so Des Brown asked in Hansard, he said, human diseases are registered risk. They have a strategy, mentions it. So 2 years on, it doesn't exist. What has the strategy been implemented? And then Lord True, who's the relevant minister, sort of says, I'm not commenting, and we've got lots of substantial planning, i.e. there seems to be none of the process required for implementing it. Okay, so that's the background. What I'd like to do to start off is by talking about how do we leave lockdown? How do we reduce the transmission rate? And I'd like to start off by talking about a process that we call solution scanning. And here's Jessica Walsh, somewhere cold, who was doing a PhD. And we'd carried out this process where we'd said, what are all the possible solutions for dealing with the problem of predators eating the birds that we care about, the birds that we want to conserve? What are all the different ways of dealing with it? And we came up with a list of 30-something different ways of doing it. And then Jessica approached 120 practicing conservationists, people that were dealing with this problem, people that were trying to stop predators from eating the birds that their job was to save, and said, which ones of these have you heard of? And all 120 of them had heard of removing the predators or controlling them, killing them. Very few of them had heard of putting snake skins on nest boxes. There's evidence that that works, or playing the radio news at them. And I've been interviewed by John Humphreys on the Today program. It's a very scary experience, and that's used in some areas. And on average, 57% of the possible actions have been heard of. And we think that this is very worrying. And our experience is that whenever we talk to policymakers, that's the case. They've only heard of a subset of the possible options. So the test I often do is to say, it's very interesting you're doing that. So do you know what they're doing in Japan? And they always say, oh, I don't know what's happening in Japan. So it seems to me the starting point is we really want to list, this is all the possible things you could do. And then you then look at what's feasible, what's likely to work, what the consequences are, and so on, and then decide what you're going to do. But starting off by just looking at a subset of options, to us, is a major mistake. So we have a process called solution scanning. And so we carried this out using a team of people from conservation evidence, from BioRisk, and from the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, which I'm also involved in, and a global team of people. So many of you will recognize Andy Dobson, a well-known epidemiologist, but there are people from every continent. There are public health experts, and veterinary people, and medics, and a wide range of different people came together. And so the sort of process we have is we say, this is the way to think about it. So if you want to reduce the transmission risk, the two main things you want to be concerned about is that people will be too close together, or that they'll touch items in common. So if the concern is that too close, can you redesign it so they're not too close? And if you can't, can you minimize by putting them together in subgroups? So we then say, so how do you achieve that? If congestion's an issue, what are the different things you can do? If people need to be close, can you reduce transmission risk by barriers? And if there's a regular group, can you divide it into subgroups, the idea of bubbles and so on. And the same with stopping people touching objects. So here's a way of thinking. So the way we say is what you want to do is to start off by saying, can we do this so no one comes within 2 meters of anyone else? Can we do it so that nobody touches something that's been touched by someone else within 72 hours or whatever the safe period is likely to be? And if not, what are the other solutions that you have, and how do you achieve that? So as an example of the sort of detail we go into, so supposing you have a shared space, it could be a canteen, a shop, an open space or whatever, and you want to spread out the use of it. It gets congested, so let's find ways of making that less congested. Here are whatever it is, 15 different ways in which you can reduce the congestion. And my experience is when you talk to people dealing with this problem, they've heard of a few of them, but they haven't heard of all of them. So why don't we say, this is all the possible things you could do, and then decide which are practical, which are realistic. So waiters driving their car when dropping off objects and people, or perhaps you don't go there by car, so that would be crazy. So you work out which are the possible realistic solutions. And we've also got this as a Shiny app, and this shows the way in which it might work. So supposing our problem is a overcrowded canteen, you go through and you look at the options that might apply to your canteen. So increased physical spacing is one of the options we give. And then you'd say, okay, well, let's move the seats 2 meters apart. And we've got some narrow tables, let's sort of alternate them. And in the long tables, let's use every second seat, expand the space or time for shared activities. Perhaps we could extend the lunch break by 30 minutes. We could share out the use of the space. Perhaps, you can only go in 4 days a week. Perhaps you have a tannoy announcement saying when the canteen's full, et cetera, et cetera. So it is taking our solutions and converting them into your practical solutions. And that's the sort of process we have. And I got our 15 minutes of fame. This was appeared in, well, we found it in over 60 newspapers. There must be in over 100 newspapers, did about 10 or so radio and TV interviews. There's lots of interest in this. And there's political interest too. We know that the UK government used it. We know that the Irish government based a lot of their work on this. So, but still, if we're to get out of lockdown, I'm still aware of the fact that some organizations have very rigorous processes that use a lot of these sorts of measures, but there's quite a few where you can sort of see very easy ways of improving and very easy methods that could be adopted. And really, if we're going to be safe and we're going to get out of lockdown at some reasonable time, we want to think about the full range of possible options. So that's what we do now. The question is, what do we do in the future? How do we stop further pandemics arising? And so we did the same thing again. We did a solution scan again with an international team of people, again with a wide range of people, medics, animal health people, et cetera, and the same exercise. And there's obviously been a lot of interest in this. And there are a lot of public statements to sort of say, well, clearly we need some action, and we could ban wildlife markets, we could ban wet markets, we could ban live animal markets, we could ban hunting, we could ban consuming animals, ban commercial trade. A whole range of different things are being pushed forward as to what to do. The point I want to make here is that this is really complicated. So for banning wildlife markets, which seems a good idea, banning trade. If you speak to many of the experts in this field, they're very reluctant to go down that route. They say if you ban it, it will become, they'll just be illegal. We know from drugs, we know from banning alcohol in the US that it just goes underground and you have no control of it. They would rather it was regulated. Many of them would rather it was regulated than banned. But I'm sure we'll go partly down that route. Or wet markets. Now, as I understand, in China, you have wet markets, and wet markets means that you wash things. So that's where you have your vegetables and your fruit and your fish and your meat and that sort of thing. And then you have dry markets where you don't want water, where you have rice and things like that. So banning wet markets, which people are talking about, is just completely unrealistic. Or stopping selling live animals, again, in some circumstances, that seems a very good idea. But in many parts of the world, there's no refrigeration. And so taking live meat animals to market is the only way of ensuring fresh products. So that's kind of difficult. Banning wild hunting, hunting is essential for the livelihood of very large numbers of people around the world still. Permanently banning wildlife consumption, which people have been talking about, so does that include fish? That's sort of, the scale of that is sort of unthinkable. Meat, wild meat is a large part of people's existences. So there's some good ideas here, and I'm sure some of it will be done, but it's unrealistic to imagine that there's a single answer that we can just adopt and that will be effective. And you can illustrate that with another way. So actually, you can think of 7 different routes by which new pathogens will arrive. So the first one is that people could encounter a diseased animal and catch the disease from that, and then it spreads. So Ebola will be an example of that. The second would be that you catch the animal and you take it elsewhere, and then the problem is elsewhere. So COVID-19, it's not entirely clear what the route is, but pangolins seem to be involved as part of the route, but it seems too complicated. Breeding, rearing of wild animals. So SARS came from Asian civets being bred in captivity. So they weren't wild animals. There were once wild animals that were commercially reared. Breeding of domesticated animals, so MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, came from dromedaries. And then we didn't talk about these in our papers, but we have antimicrobial diseases. So there's extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, and antimicrobial resistance is the big issue that we're just not considering, and that's kind of worrying. But there can also be pathogen release or escape from laboratories, as we've had with smallpox or foot or mouth. and bioterrorism. There have been attempts to use anthrax. And finally, people might intentionally create life, and that might escape. So again, the problem is that if you're looking for a simple one-off solution, there are all these possible routes. There is not going to be, so banning, lots of people are saying, well, we just need to ban the sale of imported wild animals in Southeast Asia, and it's solved. And that quite clearly is not the case. That's just fighting the last war and hoping the next war is going to be the same. It's a much more complicated problem than that. And so what we did is we looked at the wide range of possible options and then again listed the different ways of dealing with those. Next, I'd like to talk about how you integrate science and policy. And I'd like to talk about what's happening in the UK, where there's a big discussion about the government and its science advice and how it depends on science advice. And this is our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, describing the process for coming out of lockdown. And we have a quite sensible system. Many places in the world have a system like this, where you have a number of different levels, and at the high alert levels, you have very severe measures. And one, I congratulate New Zealand for coming out of lockdown, then announcing that at stage 1. So it's not known to be present. And then you have increasingly, as you go up that scale, you have increasingly serious measures. So that's quite a good way of doing things. But then the presentation where this was a very curious presentation. And I'd like to unpick it. And I'm going to be a little bit flippant and tongue-in-cheek, but I've got a deeply serious point to make at the end. So we like equations, and the COVID alert level, we showed there's a 1 to 5 alert level that determines what we do. And we have an equation. It depends on R, the rate of infection, plus the number of infections. Great, we've got an equation. But the problem is that kind of doesn't really make full sense, because it's not the number of infections, because that's the number we've had in total. What we must care about is the number of people now that are infected. So it's the number of new infections. And there's a second problem that really it adds those together. And that just doesn't make any sense at all. You need to know the interaction between R and the number of infections. So you need to multiply with. And then thirdly, R, as all of you know, is the number of people that on average, get the disease from one individual. So it's not a rate. Rate is over time. So it's an infection number. So we have this, and that's actually quite a useful number of diseased people multiplied by the rate it spreads. But of course, at that point, that will give you a value of about 3,000 or so. And the alert level we told was between 3 and 4. But if you make it into a log, we have logs for pH and earthquakes and things, log base 10, that gives you about the right sort of number. Have to rescale it a bit. We don't actually know the number of infections, we only know the number of observed infections. And so with those sorts of fiddles, you can end up with something that vaguely makes sense. But the original equation just does not make any sense whatsoever. And then secondly, we're given a graph. We're scientists, we love graphs. But again, this doesn't make any sense. I could give a whole talk on the nonsensicalness of this graph. And so what's on the y-axis? Well, what's on any axis isn't clear, but the x-axis is presumably time, and the y-axis can't be R because it never goes above 1. It must be the number of people infected. And if that's the case, then when you have the different steps will depend on the number of people infected, not the time. So there are serious problems with this. Thankfully, a school teacher saw this and decided to mark it and said, this is what's wrong with your bit of coursework. And this is sort of kind of flippant, but this is all true. All of these are mistakes that any scientist should have seen. And then the third thing that we were shown was this dial. This dial, and you recognize there are 5 different stages, there's different colors, and there's this dial showing that as the value of R goes down, then we enter the different phases. But again, this doesn't make sense. If that's a linear scale, and it can't actually necessarily be a linear scale, but if it's a linear scale, then is it when we go down to 3, actually I've just noticed it's divided into 6 units. So when we go down to a third, R is 0.33, then it's disappeared. And obviously that's not the case. So it doesn't really make any sense. And then I was having some wine last night. You can probably tell I'm having some wine from the next bit. And I then sort of thought, well, what does Doctor Who and the TARDIS look like? And I think you know about Doctor Who and the TARDIS in Canada. Anyway, so I went on the internet and looked up in the original 1963 version of Doctor Who, which I remember hiding behind the sofa and watching. And here's the inside of the TARDIS, and lots of complicated machines. And here you are in detail. And it's the same, it's the dial. So that's where I was delighted. This presumably where the inspiration came from. So none of these graphs make sense. And you could say, well, that doesn't matter. But I think there is something a lot more serious here. And I think the serious thing is that a lot of, So I'll go on. If I was to do this, I would bring together a group of people and I would say, here's the data on the number of people we think is infected with the associated error. This is the data on our value of R with the associated error. Then I'd ask you as a group of experts to say, what level do you think we're in? And that would partly be subjective. So you might say, well, we're coming into winter and there's quite a large chance there's a seasonal element, as there is in influenza. So I think we should be more cautious. There'll be all sorts of things that you want to take into consideration. And also you might want to take political and societal issues to decide where you want to be on this. So and that's how I think they do it. So the problem you have is you have a sort of a political, social, fairly fuzzy way of thinking about it, but they want to pretend that it's rigorous science, that there's an equation and a graph and a dial that says this tells you where we are. It's putting a scientific facade on it. And I think that's deeply dishonest. And it is saying we're following the science, and you can tell it's science because there's these appearances of science, and we're hiding the fact that it's a messy decision-making, partly political decision-making process. And you can see that it's partly political because although the experts say we're in 4, we're doing some of the elements of, we're partly lifting lockdown, which is 3. Our shops and officing are partly opening, which is 2. Some sports center events are opening in safe ways, and vulnerables allowed to leave home, which is 1. So politically, we're mixing this up in the way that we're doing, but we're pretending that this is science because you can then say we are following the science. And I think that's quite serious. Having been rude about this, I just want to say this is the press briefing yesterday. And if you look at the pinkish circle, it has a 95% confidence limits. And if you look at the graph on the right, it has confidence limits. So we tend to just be given, this is the answer, and there's always uncertainty. So it's great to see uncertainty being presented. So I salute them for doing that. So in making decisions, there are lots of different elements. There's the evidence, which everyone talks about, but there's also the knowledge, by which we mean the stuff that you know about, and you can trace. You can say, oh yeah, I did that and that happened, or my mate did that and I know that that went really badly or really well. And you have your experience. So we all have experience. If I showed you a poster that was too cluttered, you'd say, well, that's too cluttered. And I'd say, well, how do you know? And you just say, well, I kind of know that. You just build up an experience for how things work. And then costs, your values. Often there's much more than just the simple measure, so there's lots of things you need to consider, and then a judgment, which you then decide. So this is how we think you should make decisions. We think we want to start off with evidence synthesis. You want to say, this is the literature. A third of the literature is not in English. So we've read 350,000 non-English papers. It's unpublished literature. So you want to review that and pull that together. You then want to assess that, and particularly what does that mean for you in your local conditions, rather than just say, here's the global answer. And then you want to make a decision. And when you make a decision, you include the costs and the values and experience and decide what to do. So there's a serious division between the science that comes at the top, and then in that greenish yellow band, this is where you put the science and policy. And all decisions have a mixture of the two. So you can't say this is a scientific decision, as our government is keen to do. It's always a mixture of those. And then you decide how you're going to deliver it. Actually, I'll skip on that. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is how do you actually use experts? We talk a lot about having experts and expert decision-making. So in the UK, we have something called SAGE, which is our group that comes together in emergencies to talk about issues, and they provide their advice. How actually do you do that? And it's something that is really important and not really sufficiently discussed. So Philip Tetlock has tested experts. So he got together 284 people who are professional predictors of change. That's what they did for a living. And he asked them to make 82,000 forecasts. And they had to forecast, is this thing going to stay the same, go up or go down? So is the price of oil compared to today going to be more, the same or less expensive at the end of the year? Is the number of members of the Republican Party going to go up, down, stay the same at the next election, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what you do. And it turns out that they're less good than chance, and that experts are not significantly better than non-experts. So there's a real problem with using experts. And secondly, often we ask experts to make decisions, and you shouldn't do that. It's extremely unlikely that an expert will have your values. You know, my values are we always need more research. So I'll say that if I'm asked. So the sensible thing is to get experts to make their judgments on facts, and then you combine their judgment of the facts with your values to decide what to do. So with Mark Bergman, we became interested in how can you use experts more efficiently. And we wrote this piece. A surprising number of people asked me why there's a picture of me riding a badger on there. But anyway, so we pulled together the evidence on how you use experts. And one of the things is that your expertise drops seriously as you go away from your core domain. There really are things like experts. If any of you are thinking of going for heart surgery or having some plumbing done, then I'd strongly suggest you get a heart surgeon for the former and a plumber for the last. Expertise is really seriously genuine. The problem is, and this is shown by this graph, so I did my PhD and postdoc on oyster catchers. I know a lot about oyster catchers. I'm quite an expert. I've had research grants looking at Brent geese. I know quite a bit about Brent geese. I was then asked to be on a government panel to study badgers. Which does make sense because I'm an expert on black and white animals. So that makes sense. And then I found myself on a research council committee when we were looking at the future of research stations and how they should be funded. And I can remember saying, but, you know, if you look around, she's an expert on ecosystem services. He's an expert on DNA and Seychelles warblers. What do we know about this? And we're there because of our expertise, because we know about oyster catchers. And the problem is that experts think that their expertise goes a long way, but evidence shows it drops dramatically when you move off your core area. So, what does the experts say about using experts? Overwhelmingly, using a group of people is much better than using a single person. that drops off outside your expertise, that if you look at the things that identify experts, they're very poor at telling you whether or not you will get something right. You can buy in credibility, that's easy to do, and that works. But if your question is, I want to get something right, then these sorts of measures is extremely difficult to predict who's likely to get things right. If you have a diverse group, you're more likely to get it right. If this is sort of interesting, there's a group of people, and I think we all know that, who'll just say, well, the answer is this, and they're very convincing, and they tend to carry the meeting. There's another group of people that are very unconvincing that will say, I'm kind of not sure about this, and it's really complicated. In some ways, I think it might be this, but on the other hand, I think it could be that. And overall, on balance, I think it's probably the first one. And they never, we all ignore those because they're a bit pathetic. But they're much more likely to be right. So a lack of confidence, not being self-assured, not being assertive is correlated with getting things right. You can weight experts in order to, by giving them test questions, and you're more likely to get the right answer. And you can also provide training, providing training on background rates and that sort of thing to get people to estimate probabilities more accurately. So, and one of the best ways of doing this is something called the Delphi process. I'm so obsessed with the Delphi process, I took my family on holiday to Delphi. And what you do is you identify a problem. Now, supposing your problem is, we want to know what the value of R is. We can present the evidence. We can say, oh, here are all the different elements we have in this. And then you get this group of experts to then provide their value or their range of values as to perhaps the maximum minimum value or the best estimate or whatever, what the value of R is. And then you discuss that. And a lot of this is to get rid of the sources of bias in terms of people's prestige and who speaks, and there's all sorts of sources of bias. So it's to minimize those effects. So sometimes that is done anonymously. We don't always. And then you rescore. You've done your initial scoring, and then various people will sort of, you'll see the distribution of results. And then people say, I know a lot of you have scored that low, but I think for these reasons, it's probably going to be a lot higher than that. And you listen to that and decide whether or not you believe that, and then decide to rescore. And then you might redo that, and you present results. And that is an exceedingly powerful process for getting the right answer. And it will often, so this done by amateurs will often beat professionals, hands down. Rethinking publications. So we had the problem in the COVID crisis that we really want to get stuff out really quickly. For our solution scan, it sounds a bit ridiculous, but we thought we were saving people's lives. We thought we were enabling the world to be a safer place. We wanted people to know almost instantaneously what the possible solutions were. So you want to distribute things quickly. But we've also known, as you probably heard, there have been lots of cases of things in the non-peer-reviewed literature, up as preprints that have had problems, and there's been problems with things being peer-reviewed very quickly and turned out not to have problems. So we've got this serious issue that we want material to come out quickly, and we want it to be well refereed. So how do we overcome that? So Katrina, who was the editor of Trends in Ecology and Evolution, when we did our first horizon scanning paper, and I came up with this scheme. So they said they were interested in having a look at that paper. We knew when the workshop was, and we said exactly when we were going to submit it. We said we're going to submit it at 9 o'clock on this date, and that you don't have to do that. But that meant that she had plenty of time to find some reviewers that were free at that time. And then a week before we submitted it, we sent the draft. It was a clumsy draft, but it had all the main content there. We tidied it up a bit, but you could see we left our comments in and things, so the referees could see what we thought was weak, etc. So the referees had a week to read the draft, and then we submitted it. And when we submit it, we do this every year since then. We talk about if we've made any changes since the draft. And then, so this was peer reviewed with full detailed peer review within 90 minutes. And that kind of seems to me to be a good process that is worth thinking about in those areas where there's a real requirement for speed, but without sacrificing quality and allowing full review to take place. And that's that was the piece that came out. And there's other options. So why do we have this great diversity of papers? So if your paper's rejected, why do you have to reformat it all? Why don't we just say, here are 5 or 10 ways, and if it's a medium length paper, this all has this format. And if it's a short paper, it has this format. And you just say, well, these are the different types. And if it's a type B paper, I'm just going to submit it to that paper. And if it's rejected, I'll send it to another one, because I can then just not have to faff through reporting. And then there's other solutions to this. The peerage of science is a very interesting model, needs some more thinking about, and post-publication review, where you publish things and they then get distributed and then get commented. The environmental consequences, just like a couple of words about this. So lots of people are talking about how we can take advantage of this. So there's a lot more concern about nature. Certainly I've spent a lot of time in the outside world, and it's been great. There's greater use of cycling, less use of air transport. Some of that might turn out to be more permanent. We've learned how to do things online that we thought were impossible, and I'm sure a lot of that is going to continue. And then people are talking about much more sustainable existences. So Amsterdam's adopting the donut model to try to work out how to have a more sustainable existence. And lots of people are talking about that. So there's good news opportunities, and many, many people, including ourselves, are thinking about ways of moving to a new world. But there's a negative side we need to think about, and that is there's a push for economic growth, and sacrifices may well be taking place. Just 2 examples. In the Galapagos, at the moment, to go to the Galapagos, you have to go to one of 2 airports in Ecuador, and that means there's the biosecurity measures, and you can then go. And if we want to tighten up biosecurity, we can tighten it up there. And there's pressure now for planes to come to the Galapagos from all sorts of different places. And invasive species, such as this Phalaenus parasitic fly that's affecting woodpecker finches and many other species, they're likely to increase. And the second example is President Trump announcing, for economic reasons, the opening of marine protected areas and reducing those measures and opening up those areas to fishing. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Consequences for individuals. So I'm kind of quite lucky. So I live in a village. My daughters have come back from university, and I normally do the cooking, and they're doing a lot of the cooking. And so life's kind of quite good. Except when I did this COVID work, and I've worked harder than I've ever worked before. But anyway, in theory, it's good. We've got to recognize that there are many other people for whom this is really serious. So there are many other people for whom employment and working conditions is really difficult. And amongst academics, there's a great diversity. There's many that, they've got less pressures and they have more free time, and they can be very productive. And there's many others, particularly people who are single parents or whose partner has to work full time on some other job, which, commitment, and they've got children, and life is really, really difficult. So we set up this thing called publication partners, and that was for those people that were in that sort of position, could be partnered up with those people for whom life is good, and help them work through some papers and help them get papers published. And we then asked the scientific community, as a sign of support, the conservation community, whether or not they'd support it. And this is just, these are the conservation journals that said, we like the idea of this, we approve of this. And this is kind of all the major conservation journals are approving of this process and saying we agree with that. And that's showing how, as a global community, we can come together and support those people for whom life is difficult. Oh, and this is some idea was hatched up in combination with Mark Bergman. I took a photo at the time when we thought of it, and Frith Jarrad has since come in on the process. Then finally, how do we improve science to policy? So there's a lot of, we're very interested in the reviewing process, and the reviewing process is slow. And there's an Oxford team that's doing reviews very quickly, but it's kind of pretty inaccessible. So we think we need a different approach to review. So this is something called metadata set, which we're just doing that for invasive species and for, well, eccentrically for growing cassava as well. And it pulls down the studies that look at a range of invasive species. And then you can then do an analysis. You can then say, what's the effect of herbicides on these key species? And it'll then tell you, it'll then do a meta-analysis. It'll produce this paragraph underneath, automatically generates a paragraph to tell you what these results mean. And then if you're a bit of a nerd, you can look at value forest plots and all that sort of thing, and funnel point plots. But if you're a policymaker, you might just look at the paragraph to explain. But the neat thing about it is you can then filter this. You can filter this by design or country or duration or whether or not it's a field study or the type of herbicide or whatever. And you can then just do your own analysis. So you could say, I just want to look at the effects of glyphosate, and it'll tell you, it'll instantaneously do this analysis for you. So we call this dynamic meta-analysis, and we think it's the way of the future. It's a way of you saying, here's the global evidence, but I'm not interested in the global evidence. I want to know what will work for me now, and how do I pull that together? And similarly, 100, well, internet's unstable, that's not a good sign. 400 or 500 journals, and pulled all of that information together, which means you can just look the science up straight away. And so what we want to do is we take the review time down from a year to minutes or tens of minutes. So you can look at the literature very rapidly. So to summarize, how do you improve decision making? I've got 2 summary slides to talk about different ways of doing that. We want to look forward. We want to do more horizon scanning. We want to say what's likely to be coming up, as the biosecurity strategy should have been doing, as we do in our horizon scan. We want to consider what's the detailed nature of the threats. So in COVID, I think we haven't had enough work saying what's the threat through transmission in different routes, through touching different items, et cetera, et cetera. We really want more details as to how that works. We want to consider all the options, and that normally people just look at a subset of a few options. We then want to assess the evidence for that. We then take that evidence, we combine with knowledge, experience, and values. That's where the policymakers and practitioners take the science and put it into decision-making. It's a joint process. You want an appropriate way of using experts. The 2 worst ways are to have a single expert or a team of experts together discussing in a room. There are much better ways of using experts. And then ideally we learn from the action and then go back. Or second summary, second way of expressing it, what tends to happen is we have a problem and then a group sits around and makes a decision on what to do from its own experience and knowledge. I'm at hundreds of conservation meetings where that's kind of what we want to do. What we want to shift to is use expert elicitation, those sorts of processes I've talked about, like the Delphi technique, to assess the existing reviews, because we've got the existing reviews, so they're sitting there and waiting for people to use, to give judgments on the facts, so the value of R seems to be this, the routes of transmission seem to be this, et cetera, which then practitioners and policymakers will combine with their values and experience or whatever, and they will then make the decision based on the science. And that, to me, is the way we want to be working. And the fact that we don't work enough in that process seems to me the source of many problems. So thanks very much. And I finally like to say, so I produced a Google Doc that has the background and the references and some links and some other material. So I don't know if anyone's there. I know that 2 people are there, but if anyone wants to have a look at that, feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for a very fascinating and thought-provoking talk. There's definitely a lot of food for thought there. So while we wait for some questions coming from the audience, I have a question myself that I'd like to ask you. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what are the main challenges or barriers when communicating science to policymakers, and what advice could you give to researchers in better communication of research findings to policy, for example?
So I think there's this belief that sending a paper is very rarely, policymakers don't like reading papers. So you want a very short summary, and particularly you want to say, what does this mean to you? And particularly, you've got to understand them. You've got to understand what their job is, and particularly what the political context is. What's the decision that they're having to make? So if there's a law coming out or legislation being considered or something, then send it to them there. Then send it to them then. They're not interested in being sent things at other times often. And I would send a very short summary explaining why this is important, but send the paper as well. And I'm a great believer in giving it to them as it is. So if there are uncertainties and other factors and things, you've got to explain that. We've got to be honest about the science.
Yeah, fantastic. That's interesting. And I guess sometimes the challenges can come from communicating uncertainty and degrees of uncertainty in particular, research findings or areas.
There is a really interesting issue to do with predictions, and I don't know what the solution to this is. And so what we're tending to do now is to say the models say this. The models say this number of people will die. And the one thing we know is that isn't right. That won't be the number of people that will die from this disease. There will be errors. There'll be errors because of parameters. There'll be errors because of the way the model works, because of your assumptions. And what you'd really want to do is to give the range. And normally when there's uncertainty, so at the beginning there was huge uncertainty about how COVID operated, you have a wide range. And you then have the problem that if you tell the press it might go from this really small number to this really large number, they will say as many as this really large number of people might die. They never say as few as this really small number might die. Mm-hmm. And then when it comes back, they will say, oh yeah, the scientists said that this large number was going to die, and actually it was some middle range level. Sometimes it's quite close to what the prediction was, but they say you got it wrong. And I don't know how we deal with that. And I think that's quite a serious problem. I think we need some thinking as to how we do that.
Yeah, definitely.
We need the media to be more honest. So the up to is the killer.
Yeah, exactly. So we have another question which asks, what's the best way to identify expertise range? And are experts generally honest about the limitations of their expertise, or does this in turn need outside expertise?
So it is really, so Tetlock has, there's a game that the US military organized where they wanted people to make a set of predictions. And they had 5 teams, 3 of whom were people that did this for a living, and 2 of whom, one run by Mark Berman, one run by Philip Tetlock, were amateurs, but using decision-making processes. And with access to Google and the internet, the amateurs beat the professionals, often with security information available. So it's so how you do it really matters. And Tetlock, he has people that he calls super predictors. And these are people who keep score. They want to know how they're doing. They're very happy to change their mind when the evidence comes in. They're very open to ideas. They're very good at thinking about statistics and what a different piece of evidence would do to their probability of a certain event occurring. And those sorts of things. And the people that are dreadful, often the problem with experts is that they've got a few bits of information and they just cling on to those. They say, I've seen this, or most catastrophic of all, my research has shown. If someone's done research in an area, you can't budge them because, it's their research. So as I said, having a diversity of people and almost all the criteria that you'd expect to use. So you need some knowledge. So they've done these surveys where they've used sort of people off the street, and often they're not very good for ecological predictions. But when you're given the evidence, so when you all share the evidence, it is very hard to work out who's going to get it right. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating, sometimes unexpected as well, I guess.
Yeah.
I have a question about whether you could talk more on how do we combat the spread of misinformation and the discrediting of experts?
Yeah, that's it's really difficult, and particularly as it's got personal with Twitter. So I'm sure, well, in the UK, there's a well-known example, which I'm not going to go into, of an expert who was front page in the media because of his personal life. And that is really difficult. And there's the attacking. I got a little bit of attacking over our COVID paper. But I think we've got to just accept that's the way the world is. And I think we've got to almost move away from that and welcome that. So at the moment, we tend to say, these are the people that have access to the information. And that's the small subset of people that can decide. And we've seen with epidemiology and statistics, there are people that are not necessarily on committees who are doing very interesting analyses. And that's great. And there's a huge army of people that are doing all sorts of weird stuff. That's sort of what they call armchair experts, armchair epidemiologists. And they're kind of considered irritating, but I think we've got to welcome them and embrace them as part of the way we do open science nowadays.
Thank you. That's great. So we have a question which asks, what is your opinion on the influence of politicians and funding on science? And does it ultimately affect policy making? And have you noticed if there is a change in bad science over the years?
The change in bad science. I think we're getting a bit more rigorous in our science. I think there certainly are areas in which you hear of politicians influencing the science. I confess I've not really encountered that in my own work. But certainly there are areas, and certainly there are examples where there are things that are difficult for people to say and challenging for people to say things that go against, say, government line. And we've got to ensure that things are said truthfully.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we'll just end with one final question for today. We're focused on, do you have any thoughts for how we help prepare the public and policymakers for moving forwards or backwards along the COVID-19 alert levels?
So one of the things, this business of learning globally and learning what the options are. I think that we need to do more of that. And there are two interesting examples, as talking about the what's happening in British Columbia, where your public health expert, not quite sure what she's called, I'm afraid I can't remember her name, but she, I'm sure you all know who I mean, has done a fantastic job. And one of the really interesting things she does is she said, I don't want people to be strict. I want to educate you as to why this is important, but I don't want you to be unkind to each other. And the same is true in New Zealand, that it's a masterclass in how to deliver public policy, very honest about where we are, what the issues are. And again, she said, the last thing she said, and if you listen to her presentation, was, we're going to monitor this. We're going to ensure that these rules are stuck to. We want you to be kind to each other. We want you to go into your communities and look after each other. And I think there are lots of lessons about, draconian measures, with sort of threats don't necessarily work as well. So I think the sort of convincing and bringing the public with you is essential. And also, if you have high profile people that seem to contradict that, then that makes it difficult to bring the public along with you.
Thank you.
That's skirting around an issue.
Yeah, no, definitely. Great. So I think that's all we have time for today, but it is our great pleasure to thank Bill once again for a very fascinating talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. And thank you for inviting me again.
Thank you. And we will share the background and references link to everyone as well on Slack so that they can access references from Bill's talk afterwards. So I'll just finish it by saying that our next talk will be from Professor Andrew Reid on avoiding antibiotic resistance. So we hope that you can join us on Monday next week, the same time and same place. And in the meantime, check out our updates on Slack and our Twitter feeds. Spread the word about our seminars. And until next time, stay safe and see you again soon. Goodbye.